Mhm.
Okay, so to begin, we'd like to thank the organisers of Solve Climate by 2030, Bard College and the Open Society University Network, and the opportunity for the University of Sydney as part of the 15 Asia Pacific Rim universities participating and contributing to this global climate education project. Today's webinar is hosted by the University of Sydney with the theme title, Climate Solutions for Sydney, Australia in 2030. From where you're all zooming in from around the globe, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for being part of the solution. To begin, just a little light housekeeping, please ensure your mic is on mute. If you have any questions, please hold them till the end by using the Q&A function, and I'll read the questions to the panelists who will in turn answer your questions. We have an amazing lineup of experts today who will be presenting. Let me introduce our chair, Professor Ali Abbas, who is Director of the Waste Transformation Research Hub at the University of Sydney, with 20 plus years experience in the field of process systems, engineering, and in particular applications in low emissions technologies, waste, clean energy, biotechnology, and biomedical systems. In recent years, Ali has been working on circular economy transitions, identifying ways to translate the circular economy principles into practice, and Ali is chair of the Australian Circular Economy Conference. From New South Wales Circular, Ms. Sally Hill has kindly agreed to step in for Ms. Lisa McLean. New South Wales Circular is a New South Wales government initiative through the Office of Chief Scientist and Engineer to bring together stakeholders from across government, industry, research organisations and the community. Sally is Head of Engagement at New South Wales Circular and an expert on sustainability communications and engagement. She works to build networks amongst circular leaders, entrepreneurs, thinkers and policymakers, as well as designing and delivering exceptional online and real-world experiences that engage people with sustainability and the new economy. Ms. Linda Scott, Labor Councillor for the Sydney City Council. Linda is a strong supporter for reforming Australian Labor Party. She has successfully advocated for increased city action on climate change and new affordable housing for those experiencing homelessness. She has successfully championed for childcare and community projects and has led a citywide action to fight racism and support refugees. And last but not least, Professor David Schlossberg, who is Director of the Sydney Institute for the Environment at the University of Sydney. David is a Professor of Environmental Politics in the Department of Government and International Relations. He is known internationally for his work in environmental politics, environmental movements, and political theory, and in particular the intersection of all three with his work on environmental justice. So please welcome Professor Ali Abbas, our moderator for today's webinar. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Brooke, for introducing the webinar, and hello to all of you, and good day to all, wherever you are, and you may be joining us from. It's my pleasure to be moderating this Solve Climate 2030 webinar, Climate Solutions for Sydney, Australia 2030, on this day, Wednesday, the 7th of April, 2021. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay respect to the elders, past, present, and acknowledge the sustainable ways they managed the land for centuries. May we appreciate their connection to the land and the environment and take forward new approaches to safeguard this blessed country we are all now connected to. There is no better place in Australia than the University of Sydney to host this Solve Climate webinar. The university has a big role to play, not just in technological solutions, but also in the conversations on climate change. And it should be clear to all our student community and to the community at large that the university is serious about solving the climate change challenge. Before we begin proceedings, I should and I will thank our colleagues at the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, APRU, our partners there, particularly Christina Schonleber, who's the APRU Senior Director, Policy and Programs, for reaching out to us about partnering on this webinar. And also to Jackie Wong, Director Network Programs, for guiding us through understanding and connecting into this initiative. I also want to thank the University of Sydney team at the Office of Global Engagement, Office of the Deputy Vice Chancellor Research, for leading the organisation of this webinar, particularly Victoria Romaniuk and Brooke Colcombe Leslie. A big shout out to Brooke, who worked so actively to coordinate this webinar and make it happen. Thank you, Brooke. I want to also thank the panelists for their time today to join us, and we are looking forward very much to their input and reflections on this topic. First, I think we will start with a short video sent to us by the founders of this initiative, from the United States, the BARD Center for Environment Policy. So let's listen to the video.
Actually, it was put together by the APRU.
I beg your pardon, yeah.
Sorry. I'll just share all of that now with you.
Sure, thanks for that.
So as a resident in the western suburbs of Sydney, one of the most prominent impacts of climate change would have to be the increasing intensity and frequency of heat waves. And in particular, I realized that when you live in energy inefficient or poorly designed buildings, it's very difficult to stay cool and safe during these sweltering periods. And that's translated to me into an awareness of how the impacts of climate change are spatially differentiated, disproportionately impacting marginalized, disadvantaged communities or people in peripheral spaces.
So I might be studying in Japan now, but I'm actually coming from France, from the southern region, the French Alps. In recent years, the winters have gotten a lot warmer. We're getting a lot less snowfall. Biodiversity in the mountain has become a lot less diverse. This is a threat for my community because in my home, tourism is the main source of revenue and the main economy.
The effects of climate change in the country are manifested and felt in our food supply and in the varying weather in the country. For example, extreme drought or extreme flooding brought about by climate change can gravely affect the productivity of our agriculture and fisheries sector. More so, global warming also intensified the calamities that we face. For example, super typhoon, which isn't something that we would consider as normal 10 years ago. But because of the continuous warming of the ocean, we are now unfortunately expecting it to hit us at least once a year.
This is urgent. There is no time to lose. We have to make sure that this planet is safe for humans to live. For everyone, not just the rich. I'm Chris Tremuran from APRU. We are a network of 57 universities around the Pacific Ocean, Asia, North and South America, Australia and New Zealand. Many of you are joining Solve Climate by 2030. We can do this and we can do much more. Together we can make a difference. Let's do it.
I actually believe that everyone can do a little bit of something to fight climate change.
We've seen how the climate crisis is mobilizing an entire new generation of active performative citizens, with students in schools and universities acting in solidarity and participating in protests, demanding change.
Also, we must demand accountability from big-scale polluters such as the big companies who dominate the market and the government who leads the country, because as long as these two refuse to act upon it and neglect the reality of climate change, all our individual efforts such as tree planting or shifting to a zero waste and green lifestyle will all be disregarded, because fighting a big and complex issue such as climate change requires collective action.
Thank you very much, Brooke. So the world's top climate scientists have told us that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require global net human-caused carbon emissions to fall by about 45% by 2030 from 2010 levels, reaching net zero around 2050. Doing so would require unprecedented, rapid, and far-reaching transitions in land, energy, industry, buildings, transport, and cities. Australia continues to have its share of extreme weather events, droughts, heat waves, bushfires, and recently floods. These will be increasingly hard to manage in a global warming scenario, impacting the lives of many in diverse ways. The challenges posed by solving the climate challenge necessarily range from across history, science, engineering, business, culture, economics, psychology, religion, government, media, journalism, and the arts. Solving the climate change challenge is everyone's business. And so the question we are asking in today's webinar is, how can state and local action put us on the way to solving climate change by 2030? To answer this question, I am very honored to be joined today by 3 experts and climate change leaders in a dialogue on climate solutions, just transitions, policy, and civic action. Our panelists, Ms. Lisa McLean, has apologized and could not attend today, is today being stepped in by Sally Hill, who is Head of Engagement from New South Wales Circular. So welcome, Sally. Linda Scott, Labor Councillor, City of Sydney Council. Welcome, Linda. And Professor David Schlossberg, Director of the Sydney Institute for the Environment, Professor of Environmental Politics at the University of Sydney. Welcome, David. First, we're going to hear our panelists open the proceedings by sharing their views. We will hold off any questions until they complete, and I will then lead a dialogue with the panelists. There will then be ample time for Q&A from the audience following on in a Q&A segment before we conclude at the end with a seminar of proceedings. So let's get started. We'll start proceedings with first up is going to be Sally Hill from New South Wales Circular. Over to you, Sally.
Thank you, Ali. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us. I'm just going to share my screen to show my slides. And can you just give me a thumbs up if that's working okay? Brooke? Great. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So I guess I'm really interested in this topic because I currently work for New South Wales Circular, but I've been in the business of climate change campaigning and avoidance and now adaptation for a really long time. And like you said, Ali, it really is something that's everyone's responsibility and now touches every single part of the economy. And it's actually really exciting to see, even though it's been far too long watching the world come to grips with climate and start to deal with it. I found it really exciting the last couple of years working with New South Wales Circular that there is some urgency around the issue now. The pace of change and the pace of innovation is rapidly increasing, and particularly looking at the issue holistically, like we try to do in the circular economy, is bringing in these actors that previously haven't been involved with climate change before. And I'll explain a bit more about what I mean there as I go. But New South Wales Circular it's a Australian state government funded body. We are funded as an innovation network. So we're really designed to increase the pace of innovation around a particular area, in this case, circular economy. And it was identified by the New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer as an area of innovation that was very key to Australia's future and Australia's economy. And the timing with COVID actually has been has made circular economy appear even more important and urgent for governments, because it's really made us aware of how fragile global supply chains are, how we do need to be really resource efficient and resource self-sufficient in Australia, and where we can be manufacturing self-sufficient as well. And of course, the recent events in Australia, whether it's bushfires or flooding, have really drawn attention to the issue of climate change and made it something that everyone at every level of government is really concerned with. So New South Wales Circular, yeah, like I said, is at the moment we're purely funded to increase the pace of our innovation towards a circular economy. So we see it as something that's driving jobs, economic prosperity, but also really, really key to a zero carbon economy. And we work providing data and metrics to the market around the circular economy, around the circular economy opportunity. So we look at some small scale pilots and projects, some of them run by universities, some run by the commercial sector. And we have a chief circular economist on our team who helps extrapolate out those opportunities to the state or the national or the global level in terms of what could this look like as an economic opportunity for us to grab hold of. We are actively involved with industry, running pilots and demonstration projects around new circular supply chains. We also do a lot of networking and brokering of partnerships between government and the research and innovation sector and industry and the community sector as well. And we're also really interested in that citizens element. How can everyday people in Australia plug into the circular economy and participate? Excuse me. And just really briefly, for anyone who's not already au fait, although I'm pretty sure this is a pretty sophisticated audience, at its simplest, the circular economy is about moving from a linear to a circular economy. So right now we operate in a linear economy. So our supply chains are linear, and the way that we manufacture goods and services, and use natural resources are linear. So we source and extract natural resources, we make products out of them, we use those products, and often, as we're all really, really aware of, those products are single-use, disposable. Sometimes, even if they're a long life item, they still end up in landfill, and there's very few procedures for buyback or reverse logistics or recycling of those products. So the circular economy is an entirely new way of looking at the way we manufacture and the way that we employ and deploy natural resources. So the circular economy is about designing out waste. Ideally, a lot of the talk is about waste when it comes to the circular economy at the moment, because that really is the most urgent thing we need to do, is keep materials out of landfill and therefore reduce our burden on the natural environment. But the best and most strategic way we can address our natural resource use on this planet is to design products that don't have waste built into them. So thinking of simple examples like an iPhone or a washing machine that you might have in your home, products are not designed in a modular way or a way that they can be repaired. They're designed to be replaced, and they're designed to be disposed of. So whether it's something that's a really obviously disposable item, like a single-use plastic straw, or even something that actually looks like it should be used for a lot longer, almost everything we produce is disposable and ends up in landfill. I read a statistic the other day that 7% of the world's gold is going to be in landfill by 2030. So we're currently, our precious resources, the resources we have that are limited on a finite planet, are being used once, sometimes a few times, and then they're ending up in landfill at the end of their life. So the circular economy is about designing products that the materials in them will be used in perpetuity, ideally, and we design out waste completely, and we regenerate natural systems. So it's actually really about mimicking nature in the way that we design products and services, but also in the way we structure our economy. And the opportunity is really enormous. So globally, a couple of years ago now, I think it's much larger, but a couple of years ago, the global opportunity was put at $4.5 trillion. In Australia, a recent report from PwC valued the economic opportunity at $2 trillion for Australia's economy by 2040. Circular economy is one of these amazing concepts I find in working in sustainability, that it's something a lot of different people can grab onto. Again, people who don't necessarily see themselves as environmentalists, or don't necessarily, maybe aren't as concerned with climate change as us. It delivers on a whole lot of economic objectives as well. And it's really fun playing SDG bingo with circular economy, because it actually does connect with almost every one of the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a really nice way to engage almost anyone on sustainability by talking about what the benefits of the circular economy can be. The circular economy is also increasingly being discussed as an enabler of the zero carbon economy. So this is happening at the state government level in New South Wales, where we've just had a really successful change to our renewable energy planning. And when you look at climate and carbon at the state level, but also at the global level, we can tackle about 50%, just over 50% of our emissions really well through emerging technology around renewable energy and carbon capture. And then the rest, the remaining that we have to tackle is still in our products and in our consumption. So if we can become radically more efficient in the way that we consume products and the way that we design and manufacture and reuse materials, we have a really good chance of closing that gap towards a zero carbon economy. The other thing I thought I'd discuss briefly and go into this more in questions is that circular economy is by its nature about systems change. So scaling the circular economy, even starting to do the circular economy, requires system-wide collaboration. So that's why we as an organisation have been set up to engage with government, industry, the research and innovation sector, and the community, because it really has to touch everything. And when you look at it, you can just imagine you kind of try to tackle, say, one material or one waste stream, and it touches so many different businesses, so many different parts of our legacy infrastructure systems, waste disposal, manufacturing. It touches global supply chains, and then it also touches an end consumer. So it really is something that requires us to think holistically and about systems. This is just a little bit more about us, and I guess circular economy's ability to tackle both carbon, the biodiversity challenge, and the consumption challenge. So I won't talk too much about take and make waste, but because we've spoken about that. But what I did want to really emphasize is that circular economy gives us this opportunity to really try to decouple economic growth from the use of natural resources. So in our economies to date, our economic growth has followed the same path as our use of natural resources. So we use more resources, we deplete more resources, our economies grow. Same with climate change. As our carbon emissions have increased, so has our economic growth. And what we want to do with the circular economy is decouple these things. So talk about prosperity, everyone having everything that they need, but actually having economic, are you waving at me, Ali? I wasn't sure whether you're trying to get my attention. No? Okay. So economic growth continuing, but our burden on the planet actually decreasing, whether that's through climate change or biodiversity, and the use of natural materials. Other thing I just mentioned here too is really the systems transformation is unlocking this amazing amount of innovation in business, in utilities, things that our most base needs are energy, waste, water, and every product that we touch and use each day. We are seeing an incredible amount of innovation around service-based business models. So companies tapping into this trend that it's not, people don't necessarily want to own everything anymore, and they just want use of products. So if that could apply to an example of a car share in cities, people are finding they can save up to $8,000 a year from not owning a car, and they can use a car that they don't need to park and they don't need to maintain by using a car share service. There's some other really interesting examples emerging, like with utilities. There's technology coming online that will allow people to capture rainwater locally, use and store it, and even recycle water in their homes. And so there's an incredible amount of innovation coming online, and really we're finding that we as government have to just try to keep up with that pace of change, and really the challenge is about helping unlock innovation by making sure that our legacy infrastructure and these structural barriers that are in place, whether that's our waste management system, our water systems, our current ways of doing business, just don't get in the way, and that we have more of an open framework for how new innovation can plug into cities and places. So our work, if anyone wants to check it out, we're just at newsouthwalescircular.org. But we are publishing data at a national level now in collaboration with other states and with Planet Arc. We are working on circular supply chains and circular sector transitions, and we work on collaboration across government, industry, research, and community. We have a task force program, so we run a cross-departmental New South Wales government task force. We have a finance and investment task force that's looking at creating circular economy guidelines for the finance sector, doing things like framing up circular economy as an investment class so that the new projects and deals can be done in the circular economy, therefore promoting this, this as a really investable, exciting opportunity for finance sector. Citizens, we're doing some work around developing circular economy hubs, a playbook for councils to be able to roll out a physical and digital hub for citizens to be able to plug in and participate in the circular economy, and for businesses and councils to interact with them. We have a research task force, which Ali and Professor Abbas is part of, and that's gaining steam, and we're soon to feed in more and more industry challenges into that research sector and really try to use the research sector as another engine for innovation. We have a policy task force that's about breaking down policy barriers. Infrastructure in precincts, as you can imagine, a lot of our infrastructure in cities is really old, but we do have some really amazing opportunities in New South Wales at the moment around new precincts that are being developed and can have circular service-based infrastructure built into them from the ground up. We have some circular supply chain focus areas at the moment: plastics, end-of-life solar panels and batteries, textiles and organics. And we're soon to launch these sector focus areas. So circular finance, as I mentioned, looking at things like circular economy as an investment class, and what are the guidelines, how to finance financial institutions understand circular business models, which are really different to traditional business models, and therefore how do they invest in them. Looking at circular construction, which is a huge source of waste in Australia, and landfill, construction and demolition waste. Circular agriculture, which is an incredible opportunity to reduce carbon emissions when it comes to feeding people and moving food around more efficiently. And circular tech, which is really interesting from both the point of view of e-waste, but also the tech that can enable supply chain systems change. So things like blockchain technology, which can help us understand the movement of materials around the world around us. As I mentioned, we have a chief circular economist on our team now. I just wanted to draw attention to her work. If you follow us or subscribe to our email, she's now doing a briefing every 2 months on particular areas of the circular economy. Last time it was around key sectors that will catalyse innovation, and she had a look at the waste export bans coming in Australia and how those are going to start impacting our need to reuse more of these materials that have been banned from exporting overseas. And she's looking at key sectors that are starting to move on circular economy and how they're doing that. And just another tip off, we just had a really amazing session last week at City Talk, City of Sydney. Linda, it's an amazing initiative that City of Sydney does. Really brilliant panel with David Gonski, Matt Keynes, Ali Stegel, and Lisa, our CEO. If anyone wants to check that out, they just went onto YouTube today. And this amazing man from Fire Sticks, who is an Indigenous elder who works on preserving and managing land in Australia in a circular and regenerative way. And that's all. I won't take up too much more time and can go into more in the questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sally. That's really good and a very nice overview of the activities of New South Wales Circular. And next up, we have Linda, please. And Linda's going to talk to us about sustainability in local councils or local government.
Thanks so much, Ali. It's a real honour to be here. And like everybody, I would like to start by just paying my respects to the many different Indigenous lands around Australia. And I understand here the audience is global. So I'm coming to you from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders. And as you did, pay my respects to the custodianship and care of the land, so that it's in the state that we find it today as a result of their sensible, wise, sustainable management. I'm going to take it as read with this audience that we all are convinced of the case that climate change is real. There is a massive scientific evidence about the need to reduce our global warming to a sustainable amount, and we are not yet on that trajectory, and so action is urgent. As one of my great honours, I'm, as people have said, the Labor councillor here in the City of Sydney, but also the head of the state and the national bodies for Australia's local governments. So My job is to sit round the table representing Australia's 537 local governments with our Prime Minister, our Premiers and our Treasurers as part of the National Federation Reform Council, and also do a lot of work to engage both as a decision maker and also an advocate as part of our Australian Federation structures. As you can imagine, local governments really, at the behest of our communities, are leading the way with respect to ensuring that our places that we all govern, the cities, the towns, the tiny villages in very remote Australia, are places that future generations can live. And so a big part of that is not just collecting the rubbish, looking after the roads and footpaths, building pools or parks or skate ramps or childcare centres, but also making sure that the air is clean, the water is drinkable or swimmable, that we have heat effects that are not so hot, and we are approaching places in Australia where this is a viable concern. We don't have such strong urban heat island effects that people can no longer live in those places. And so local governments for many, many years now in Australia have been looking at our places and looking to see what we can do to both mitigate the impacts of climate change, so planting more trees to mitigate, for example, against the urban heat island effect in Western Sydney, or making sure that we have alarms up in far north Queensland, like the Wujal local government area, who have put in alarms to warn them of impending tidal disasters and other natural disasters that they face on a more common basis, terribly, to make sure that their communities are warned of these disasters and are safe. So local governments across Australia are finding very different and unique ways to mitigate against climate change, but also importantly, of course, to prevent our planet from warming, to take steps to reduce emissions. Many councils now in Australia have declared climate emergencies. Many councils have set their own emissions targets, including my own at the City of Sydney, setting emissions targets not only for our own local government emissions, making sure that our garbage trucks and our pools and our other community services that we run are themselves reaching net zero, but also working with our communities to set emissions targets for our local government area. I want to be very clear that, of course, we can't do this in isolation. Of course, local governments need national governments across the world. Of course, we need state governments to act in Australia and across the world. But it doesn't excuse us in any way from not playing our part. It doesn't take away from what we all need to do together to make a difference at the local level. And so that's what we've tried very hard to do. I'd like to really call out a couple of practical examples for you. And the first one is, and I'm very proud to say, a great research partnership with the University of Sydney. Before I was elected into these positions, I had a great job at the University of Sydney. It's an institution I feel very warmly about, but also I had the joy of seeing the wonderful innovation and how it could really transform practice in the real world. So one of the first things I was very proud to do when I was elected to the head of our state peak body, Local Government New South Wales, was introduce a research fund to enable councils to engage with innovation at universities. And this has prospered. It now funds quite a lot of research with our state's councils. But our first project, in fact, was with Ali Abbas and his team generating a code, a guide for local government engineers, so that when they were going out and building footpaths and roads, we love our local government engineers, we love them, but we also know they love to follow guides and codes, and indeed they're mandated to, getting Ali and his team to help us design compliant codes and guidelines for building roads and footpaths and cycleways that integrated recycled content, recycled material into those things. so that when our engineers came to us and said, we'd love to use recycled materials, but it's not in compliance with the standard, we could help them with the standard that could allow them to feel comfortable they were upholding their professional obligations, but also taking, in fact, the waste that councils collected and popping it back to make road bases that councils built. So truly a circular system within each and every local government. And we're so grateful to Ali and his team for that work. Councils are, of course, doing things on energy as well. The City of Newcastle, which is a major metropolitan hub just outside Sydney, is in fact the first local government in Australia to adopt a comprehensive urban forest policy. They're the first New South Wales council to be 100% powered by renewable energy. They're the fifth Australian city to join the Sustainable Development Goals Cities Challenge, which many of you would know is a fantastic global challenge to get cities and other key urban centres to adopt those goals and to make a strong contribution to them. And then they've used those Sustainable Development Goals to guide their 2030 plan for the City of Newcastle. And they've made, as a result, significant improvements to the natural environment, to the way that they manage their waste, greenhouse emissions, energy and resource efficiency, and they've made also a huge contribution to increasing cycling networks and footpaths to encourage more walking and cycling. They've introduced electric charging vehicle stations throughout the local government area, and they've transitioned their own council fleet to electric vehicles. And for those of you watching that don't know Newcastle, perhaps the most notable thing about this is that it is one of the most intensive coal mining regions in Australia, and the surrounding areas, the economy is very reliant on mining. There's an enormous port there that traditionally has been a very significant coal mining port. And so this is, again, one of Australia's most intensive emitting regions that has done the work to make itself the first local government to be powered by 100% renewable energy. And this has been done by a mayor, Natalie Nelms, that has consistently been re-elected on the back of a just transition agenda, on the back of political leadership to make the very difficult case in communities that rely on very intensive emissions generating industries, that she could guide not only an economic transition, but an emissions transition. And she's done that with great political success, with great economic success, but most importantly, with great success in actually reducing emissions, in actually achieving change in that region. So if you're all looking for a great case study of great local leadership, and that has actually leadership that has achieved that change, then the Newcastle case is a really fantastic one. It's also notable, of course, because it's not a global city. So often we hear about the work that's being done in New York or London, and of course in Australia, often Sydney. But I'm really impressed to see these regional examples in difficult communities that are not necessarily the first you would think of as communities who are very aligned with the need to act on climate change politically. As I think the bold, magnificent examples that we should be calling out as those ones that we need to learn from and adopt. I'd like to, I guess, just end by highlighting that I'm obviously enormously impressed by the work that local governments are doing. And indeed, it is some of the work that is leading to the most emissions reduction. In the City of Sydney, my own council, we've seen, for example, the Better Buildings Partnership, a collaboration with our big building owners. And I know Professor Schlossberg might talk about this a little bit, perhaps because he's done some great work with the City of Sydney and our resilience network. But these kinds of partnerships with our building owners, we know buildings in cities are some of the greatest emitters. And the partnership that we've been able to achieve to see them all reduce their emissions and frankly save extraordinary amounts of money at the same time in their energy costs has been a great example of city leadership. I'm still very much focused on helping our residential neighbourhoods roll out changes. It still is the case, unfortunately, in the City of Sydney, that if you live in a heritage conservation area, an area with lots of terraces, you can't put terraces you can't put solar panels on your roof if it's north facing. So councils have a lot of levers. We have a lot of levers with our building owners, but we have a lot of levers with our planning controls, with our waste mechanisms, with the way that we build energy systems into our new buildings or require them in our new developments. A lot of levers to act ourselves, but also to support our communities acting. And then finally, to use the great mouthpiece that we have as elected representatives to shine a light on the great work that's being done and in fact how it can save money. So what's been very interesting to me in dealing with mayors from across the country, many of them are again not from communities that have a strong view about climate change. Many of them indeed have a majority of climate skeptics in their local government areas. They've taken bold steps to reduce their emissions, and they've convinced their communities that they've done so because it's just saved their councils so much money, and that is always a priority for government. So whatever the messaging is, whether it's to act on climate change because that's its own moral imperative, whether it is a message about saving communities money, whether it's another message. I'm really impressed by the work that local governments across Australia are doing, and I'm very proud to be the head of their peak body to support this work that they're doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Linda, very much, and thank you also for all the hard work you're doing on the ground on these issues. Next up, please, David. And David is going to share with us some thoughts on solving climate using multiple pathways.
Thanks, Ollie, and thanks everyone for inviting me. I also want to acknowledge that I live and work on unceded Gadigal land, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Yes, we're in a dire climate situation. I don't have to go through all the scientific specifics of what we're already experiencing and what we are to expect here in Australia or Sydney. We've lived through the bushfires and the smoke, the storms, the floods, the heat waves, and the anxiety. There's quite a bit to solve when it comes to our current climate emergency. So I just want to talk about a few different things in this short presentation. I do think it's important, especially for our international audience, to understand the Australian context, the national context. I also want to talk about this whole problem-solving idea and the problem of silver bullets. And then I'll talk in a bit more depth about some of the work that I've done with the City of Sydney on adaptation and resilience in particular. And then I want to come back to a broader issue, which for me sort of complements the circular economy work, and that's about our broader relationship with environments. So look, if we are going to solve the climate problem soon, we have to talk about the failures of the Australian national government to start. And let's be brutally honest here. The current government won't dare use explicitly denialist language, but national policies for addressing climate change and its impacts are weak or non-existent. Positions and policies on every aspect of the emergency, on mitigation, on disaster response, on adaptation, resilience, transition, a more sustainable economy, any sort of vision of a transformed future are absent or not up to the task. And that's by design. Right? It's a very purposeful delay and abdication of responsibility. So currently, Australia has no real mitigation policy. It has no energy transition policy nationally, no adaptation policy, no forward thinking about a more sustainable economy. Absolutely no response equal to the task of our new normal state of climate emergency. The Australian government nationally has been dedicated to not solving the climate problem, and instead, over the last decade, is focused on sabotaging global negotiations, sabotaging domestic energy and emissions policies, sabotaging planetary ecosystems and the reef, sabotaging the renewables industry, sabotaging adaptation research, and really sabotaging the safety of its own populations, of human and non-human alike. Just on the question of adaptation, where most of my work sits, the current government closed the CSIRO Climate Adaptation Flagship in 2014, one of the best adaptation research hubs in the world. They ignored the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy of 2015. They defunded the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility in 2017, and they ignored the National Disaster Reduction Framework in 2018. And most recently, while there were 80 recommendations by the Royal Commission into the bushfires released last year, little has actually been done and more has been forgotten. And instead we have a gas-led recovery proposal by the government, which would obviously make most things worse. So to solve the climate problem in this country, getting a national government to take it seriously and to act would be a good first step. But that means addressing the powerful grip of the fossil fuel industry on government action, and to be fair, the grip on the opposition as well in this country. So why go on about that? Why sort of set that stage? Because if we are going to solve the climate problem here in Australia, the government in Canberra is a major obstacle. And like so many other problems in this country, then solutions have been left to the states and the local governments. And just a deep appreciation to Linda and all of the work that she's doing on that account. But I do want to say that when it comes to solving climate, government isn't the only obvious obstacle. How we understand the problem itself can make a solution more difficult. And to be honest, I was a bit hesitant about the title of this series of events, Solving Climate by 2030. And it's not because we can't do it. The problem is clearly fixable with some authentic effort. The issue for me is that often this idea of solving climate often means that folks focus on that sort of single big idea, the silver bullet that will once and for all solve the singular problem of climate change. So we see this all the time on the mitigation side. This silver bullet and technology has been a pipe dream for many. So, nuclear power will address all of our problems, carbon capture, electrifying, everything, the gas-led recovery, and then of course, geoengineering, if none of that works in time. And that's just not the way to think about our predicament. That sort of silver bullet approach is just a bit naive and willfully ignorant of the range of things that we already know how to do and have to do to address the level of climate change that we're about to face. So the reality is that the problem of climate change is complex. It's going to take whole systems approaches to address, and we need a broad, pluralist, and transformative set of approaches at a variety of levels to address mitigation, adaptation, and our broader relationship with the environment. A while back, Bob Sokolov and Steve McCullough at the Princeton Environment Institute introduced a response to climate change that they called the stabilization wedge approach. And even back then, the argument was that we could cut emissions using a whole range of different already existing approaches or wedges applied together. That wedge approach, that diverse approach, still works well for mitigation. And of course, different wedges work better for different regions, different conditions, different levels of government, for different industries. And I think this idea of wedges or a pluralistic approach is also available outside of the mitigation space. So, for example, just look at the sheer range of things the Biden administration has done in the past few weeks in the US, implementing a long list of environmental and climate policies and solutions into a number of different administration positions and offices, executive orders, legislative proposals, advisory groups, a whole range of issues. And I think that sort of wedge approach, that diverse approach, that pluralistic approach is where some of the more creative local strategies are exemplary. Linda and Sally both gave some examples, and I'll just plug the University of Sydney here and their recent sustainability strategy, because that recognizes the breadth of the areas necessary to make the institution as a whole more sustainable. It addresses research, education, waste, energy, water, food, travel, biodiversity, and ethical procurement and investment. So it's not just about the one big thing, cutting emissions or divestment, but about changing the practices and the everyday life of the campus, the staff and the student experience in numerous ways. Now, the other thing for me about solving climate by 2030 is that we often tend to focus on mitigation alone, on cutting the emissions that add to climate change. And that's great, but it's clearly not enough. This focus on solving climate change assumes that we can actually fix the problem and be done with the issue. That may be reassuring, but it's also obviously unrealistic because the climate emergency is not a one-time thing. No matter what we do with mitigation, we'll be facing the impacts of climate change for generations. Yes, the less change, the better, but there's still going to be growing change and impacts nonetheless, things that we've already been feeling here in Australia and across the Pacific. The science tells us and the politics guarantees that more damage will come from climate change. More people will be displaced, more communities decimated, human and non-human alike. And the mental health impacts will follow, increased depression, PTSD, anxiety, along with grief and loss. And again, we've seen this all across the region. Actually, increased anxiety in the public was the most common response that we saw in the focus groups that we did in partnership with the City of Sydney, with people who had experienced shock events such as floods and bushfires and heat waves. And I think we just really can't forget that idea of climate anxiety and the mental health impacts, and I will come back to that. Now, during the terrible summer of 2019 and 2020, in the midst of the fires, the Prime Minister suggested that a shift to a greater focus on resilience and adaptation was now necessary. The Science Minister suggested adaptation as a way to move on from discussing climate change. But of course, both refused to acknowledge the relationship between addressing emissions on the one hand and the need for adaptation on the other, and both, of course, ignored the government's cuts to adaptation research and planning. There's been at least some recognition for the need to focus on adaptation. There's been a lot of movement, as Linda said, at the local government area and some at the state, but we just haven't seen the kind of growth necessary in state and local funding for adaptation planning. So this is in part why so much of my own work has been on questions of adaptation and resilience, because solving climate means we need to be creative about how we adapt and how we become more resilient. We need to design and implement inclusive and participatory processes for reflecting on the existing and growing impacts, on ongoing decision-making, and the design of adaptation pathways for the short, medium, and long term. And again, this is one of the reasons why I've been impressed with both the process and the content of some of the City of Sydney's work in their adaptation policy, in their Resilient Sydney strategy, in their social sustainability strategy. All of these policies have been multifaceted and all have been inclusive as well. Now, I'm a bit biased because, as Linda mentioned, one of my teams ran the resident consultation for the city's adaptation policy. But it was very clear that residents wanted a broad range of initiatives. They wanted the city to address the obvious risks like heat waves and flooding and wind. They wanted to bring attention to the impacts, not just on human populations, but on native flora and fauna across the city. They wanted also not just to talk about adaptation, but they wanted to link that with addressing emissions and developing a more sustainable economy. So residents were really forthcoming as well. They were not just concerned about the risks of climate change, or even just about how we design adaptation. They were very concerned about their most vulnerable neighbors, illustrating a real care and attention to issues of justice along with climate impacts. It wasn't just about the risk of heat, it was about those particular populations that were vulnerable to heat waves. So adaptation is what you do when you think thoroughly and strategically about a climate challenged future. And this kind of proper adaptation process demands participation and inclusion of the knowledges across the community. It also demands a deep dive into local and embedded knowledge, including the knowledge of Aboriginal communities. There is real sustainability knowledge embedded in country across Australia. Aboriginal cultures lived through the last major set of changes to this continent. They have the oral history to reflect both on that change, and on successful adaptation strategies. And we do have to remember that the continent had stability and sustainability for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, only undermined in the last 250 of colonization and industrialization that was ignorant and destructive of those knowledges. So broad community knowledge, broad inclusion of that knowledge is absolutely crucial to design inclusive community-based adaptation pathways and transformative change. The last thing I want to say about that is it's really crucial to understand the other kinds of benefits of such public inclusion and participation. Again, in a recent set of workshops that we did with affected communities in rural New South Wales for Department of Environment and New South Wales Health, we learned that community members see community-based resilience and adaptation planning as one way to address their very real sense and growing sense of climate anxiety. So engaging people in community planning for their own climate impacted future is key to address a number of the issues communities are facing and will continue to face, including anxiety. And for those interested in those kinds of responses to climate change, the Sydney Environment Institute is partnering with Future Earth Australia and Western Sydney University to co-host a summit on reimagining climate adaptation starting on the 19th of April. Now, the last thing I want to say really briefly is I just want to come back to this idea of a circular economy and emphasize one more point, because I don't think it's just about the technology, and I don't think it's just about inclusive planning, and I don't think it's just about broadening our understanding of adaptation and emissions reduction. We simply have to challenge the way that we think about the human relationship with the environments in which we are immersed. We have to challenge the prevalent idea that we are disconnected from our environments, that there is an away from our pollution and waste that is separate from us. So the circular economy, the sustainable economy, acknowledges and is attentive to this obvious point that we are immersed in a functioning environment. One of my other research projects was on these kinds of new sustainable economic practices, people who are redesigning food systems and energy systems in sustainable fashion. And we looked at the motivations for that kind of action and found a huge interest in the idea of using new material systems, new circular systems, to critique the standard disconnection from the natural world and to design and engage and popularize new forms of reconnecting to those environments. There's a real interest in paying attention to the flows of supply chains and to the realities of natural systems. It's about understanding the damage that comes from willful neglect of material flows and about the construction of more connected, more attentive, and more sustainable material flows. So that idea of the circular economy is not just a new way to make stuff, and it's not even just about being more efficient about waste. It's about really rethinking our physical material place in our own environments. So that's my broad pitch for thinking broadly and pluralistically about solving the current crisis. We need a whole range of solutions, not just one, a whole bunch of wedges. The good news, I think, is that with all of these approaches, they're all right there in front of us. A lot of work is already being done, demonstrating the range of examples you've heard today. We are fully capable of solving the climate problem, and quickly. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. And we deeply appreciate your reflections and thoughts and your hard work on these areas. Next, before we start a dialogue session with our panelists, we're going to just break the webinar a little bit and watch two short videos. We heard today the speakers say that this is not about technological actions, but we want to also highlight technological solutions through our sustainability strategy at the university through the Living Lab type of initiative on campus. Two projects in particular being highlighted by these short videos are our eco-pavement project using recycled materials in pavements on campus, and also our battery-backed solar benches on campus that the students are enjoying these days. Please, Brooke.
Concrete is everywhere. It has built the foundations of our society for thousands of years. It has a simple recipe: sand, cement, and coarse aggregates such as rocks and stones from riverbeds. However, the environmental impacts of concrete are anything but simple. The production of cement is responsible for 8% of all CO2 emissions. If the cement industry were a country, it would be the third largest CO2 emitter in the world. As we continue to need houses, bridges and pavements, we will be forced to face the problems of this millennia-old material. Fortunately, beneficial reuse of waste and industrial byproducts can replace these ingredients. Every year in Australia, over 100 million tonnes of coal is burned, producing approximately 12 million tonnes of fly ash, the majority of which is stockpiled. This fly ash has shown that it can replace cement. We also have millions of tonnes of glass, either stockpiled or disposed of in landfills. When crushed, this waste glass becomes a resource that can replace sand and coarse aggregates. Upcycling these products in concrete creates an environmentally friendly product that reduces our carbon emissions and saves our natural ecosystems. These are the materials inside our green concrete, which combines fly ash and waste glass to produce a concrete that is environmentally friendly without sacrificing strength. A key innovation is to incorporate CO2 directly into the concrete mix, which locks away carbon dioxide into a stable mineral form before otherwise entering the atmosphere. Our first eco-pavement has been successfully poured on campus using these resources. We are working together as researchers, engineers, industry partners and certifying authorities on green concrete innovations to build greener pathways to our future. This project is led by the University of Sydney's Waste Transformation Research Hub in cooperation with industry partners and the University Infrastructure Team. The project was funded by the University of Sydney's Industry and Community Engagement Seed Fund.
I think it's time for us now to open the dialogue with our panelists, and I might start with Sally. Sally, if I can ask you, please, regarding the work that the New South Wales Circular is doing, and from your reflections on your experiences on circular economy, why do you think the circular economy needs to be broader than waste, but a systems change, as you described it, across the whole economy?
This has been fairly well established by Ellen MacArthur Foundation's thinking on the circular economy, and kind of the way it's defined is that when we talk about the circular economy, if we're only talking about the waste at the end of the line, we're just very, very limited in how we can approach the problem and solve for it. If the way that products end up in waste collection is very far from optimal in terms of how they would be manufactured into new products. It's because they're mixed, they're not in clean waste streams, they're often built in products that there's polymers. You could probably explain this better from a technical point of view, Ali, in terms of how materials are combined, and they're not designed in ways where they can be easily pulled apart again and turned into new products. So we really have to go all the way back to the design stage for products, but also for services and how we use things, and also the design of our economies and our distribution systems, our logistics systems and our infrastructure. So it's really a design challenge, the circular economy. But then when we start to take it up to that design level, you see changes in the waste streams reducing, you see changes in carbon emissions reducing, and you see all kinds of other benefits actually in terms of resilience of local economies. So I hope that answers the...
I think it does. I think you mentioned it in your talk as well. Design is so important. I also focus a lot on design these days in the research we do, the engineering research, the product design, the process design, and all aspects of business design and business modeling and so on. The word design, I think the design activity is so important. In fact, it is the first step in the circular economy, as you say it. So it does have a cascading effect on all subsequent steps of a product's life cycle, if you like, and the emissions that come out from a product at all the steps in its life cycle. Sally, what do you think is the biggest barrier for implementing the circular economy?
I think it's probably that legacy infrastructure that I've mentioned a couple of times, and I think policy barriers and policy conditions, but they are beginning to change fairly rapidly. Like Linda mentioned a couple of examples of where councils are working really hard to just ensure that whatever the barriers that are seen to be in the way are removed really quickly for people to move to using renewables. Similar with the circular economy, the benefits and the cost savings are really obvious. So if the case is able to be made that there's a really good economic opportunity as well as an opportunity to reduce our material footprint and environmental footprint, we are seeing some pretty swift moves on policy. I also think for companies, there's a transition stage in the circular economy that is, and for councils and governments, there's a transition phase that's seen as really challenging, and that's one of the key things that we're trying to tackle through the work we do is how do we help people get over that inertia or that initial kind of big leap of innovation that they need to make, or the leap of changes in thinking that they need to make. And some companies, individual brands have done exceptional things in terms of taking a leap in their thinking and then reorienting their design teams and their factories and their businesses around it. But not every business is in a position to lead in that way. So we're discovering that we want to try to provide opportunities for companies to be assisted in that initial transition phase and have the opportunity to run successful pilots and tests so that the case can be made really, really clear that there's a positive, really, really positive benefits on the other side.
Yeah, I do find it at times through the work we're doing sometimes challenging to measure the benefits, if you like. So that's something we're in fact working on. Can I cross over to Linda, please? And just, in terms of policy and in terms of local governments, we know they can make certainly a lot of impact locally. Why do you, Linda, see the governments as important players in climate action?
Well, look, I think we all are important players in climate action, has been so well argued by others. But my job as the head of the local governments in Australia is to really highlight the work that they are doing. I think, however, their advantage that is quite different from others is that they are, of course, a level of government, so they have levers to both set incentives and disincentives to enable their communities to act, but also they understand the different motivations for individual communities, and I think that's a very important part of the component of how they can act in a way that their communities support, that's relevant to their local area, but that also has the overall net benefit of reducing emissions. I mean, David, has rightly pointed out that the City of Sydney is doing a lot of good work. When we talk to our communities, they strongly advocate for very progressive action on climate change. If you go to Burke, which is a very remote part of Australia, if you go to central Queensland, these communities would not be the same. They would not advocate for the same thing. They're heavily reliant on mining and those other emissions intensive industries. And so these local governments, and this is why I highlight them, know what motivates their communities, and they're finding ways to act on emissions reduction strategies using the motivations of their communities and using the local conditions that matter to those communities. You know, finding what those communities love and turning it into climate action. And that is really different across Australia. It's really different in many different parts of Australia, and that's why I think local government action on climate change is so important, because it can deliver those real results with community backing, but the reasons why they're doing it and what they're doing is different across those 537 different local governments.
Excellent. I think I'm quite heartened that there's, from your perspective, you see the local councils, local governments. I'm very heartened to hear that the change and transitions are certainly taking place. So that's really, really good. Again, in a similar question to you, Linda, what do you think are the barriers for local councils to implement action?
There's many barriers. I see someone's asked a question, about kind of local effects. And I mean, I'll give you some great examples. During COVID, we had some health orders that were put in place by our state government that allowed our councils, like my own, to build bike paths. Now, I'm a great supporter of bike paths. I've supported everyone that's come to my council. But when you build a bike path outside somebody's front door, as you would know, it's often pretty contentious. I note for those of you that know her, Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London's wife, recently had this great tweet on social media about this boat that's been stuck in the Suez Canal, aligning it kind of with the community concern that can really blow up about bike paths in a local neighbourhood. So I don't want to paint this sort of rosy picture that pushing through with climate action, be it building more sustainable transport routes or reducing emissions, is an easy thing to do. It's difficult. You've got to make the long-term case for why it's important. You've got to make the moral case, the economic case, the science case, all of these avenues one needs to pursue. But if we don't, all of those things that David has highlighted, the science of the disasters, the mental health implications, the places becoming unlivable, all of those things are our future. So finding creative ways to do that, I think are really important, can be done at the local level, but I don't want to take away from the fact that that can often at the very, very local level be very difficult. We've had a scenario this week just in New South Wales where a former Prime Minister was appointed to head up a board in our state, New South Wales. He was tasked in that role with looking for investment opportunities for the state to meet their net zero emissions. He's also a former investment banker. He's on the opposite side of politics from me, but no doubt eminently qualified for the role. It took 5 days for the state government to come under such criticism that they sacked him. So, this is still extremely politically contentious and extremely difficult issue, and the political environment in Australia makes it very, very much more tricky to progress.
Very tricky for business to make decisions as well due to that. Yes. Thank you, Linda. David, look, I've been very much a recent, built recent interest in your research, especially since we sat next to each other on one of the panels at the university. Heard you talk about climate resilience and adaptation. You mentioned the case about Western Sydney, and on that day, you mentioned how people in Western Sydney experiencing hot weather, heat waves, are severely affected, their lives even at stake here. So I've become more interested. You talk about climate adaptation, resilience, and climate justice, and how they're all linked. Can you break that down for us, David?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Yeah, well, thanks for bringing up the Western Sydney example. And it was good to see one of our students, actually a research fellow, an honours fellow here at the Sydney Environment Institute, is doing that research on heat in Western Sydney. And look, one of the things about heat, and Linda mentioned this earlier, it's going to be impossible to live in places when the temperature regularly gets up above 40 degrees. and we've seen this out in Penrith. And for me and my interest in environmental and climate justice, heat waves are the single most sort of discriminating disaster, because it's only poor people who die in heat waves. Only poor people, right? People who have air conditioning and people who can afford to run air conditioning, they're just fine, right, as long as the power's on. So it really is only poor people who are the worst impacted. I mean, obviously there are climate and environmental injustice implications of a range of other sorts of impacts when it comes to flooding, right? If you know a flood is coming, if you have the resources to go, if you have a car and you can get into it and you can afford a hotel elsewhere on higher ground, great. But if you don't have transportation, you don't have access to transportation, you don't have the money to spend on a hotel or family to take you in, then the impacts of that disaster are inequitable and an injustice. And often people are left on their own to deal with their own problems in issues like that. So whenever I talk about adaptation and resilience, and I think this is a real sort of mark for the city of Sydney, they've done a really good job being attentive to these kinds of differential impacts. But I do think, and Linda's right, I do think that the residents of the city of Sydney have a huge impact on that. So when we did the work with the city of Sydney on adaptation, for example, and I'll just use this as an example, the city presented the research on the parts of the city where heat was going to get worse. And it was just the local government area, pretty compact as opposed to the larger metropolitan area of Sydney. And the immediate reaction from residents in the audience looking at this data was, well, you don't have to worry about these people up here in Woolloomooloo in some of the richest neighborhoods. They'll be just fine. You need to focus your attention down here in Redfern, where the housing estates are, or in Glebe, where the housing estates are. Those are the people who are going to be most affected. So it was the public who immediately made a shift from just thinking about risk, heat as a risk to the city, to the differential vulnerability that different people had. And to me, that was just really heartening. That wasn't something that we did. That was something that came authentically from people. And I do think that Linda is absolutely right. You talk to and you listen to people in different places about what it is that matters to them, what it is that's impacting them, what it is that is concerning them, and you address those issues. So just going in, again, this gets to the silver bullet idea. You just go in with the same adaptation plan everywhere. It's just not going to work, right? If you just are, an opposition leader in this country and you just say, we're going to have a just transition, but you don't talk about what that means to specific communities who are going to be harmed by being left high and dry by fossil fuel industries leaving them, you're not going to be successful. You need to be targeted, you need to be specific about what justice means in the policymaking in those particular places. And people do react to that. People do react positively to those kinds of proposals that address equity and justice in addition to climate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, David. That was my second question. I think you've answered it, was about communities and how they can act locally. I think maybe I'll open this question up to the three panelists, and please feel free to jump in. How can communities locally contribute to climate action?
We've got an election coming up, so voting, around the world, voting for candidates that are, people who put forward policies and future visions about action on climate change. That's one thing that many of us who live in democracies can do. Obviously, there's so many things that you can do in your household. And I love Sally's presentation and the work that New South Wales Circular is doing, because actually there's so much in the waste space that we can do at home, and we've got our little compost bin, and you just don't realise, but taking all that food waste out actually just makes such a difference to how much we're putting in landfill, so some of those really practical actions can make a difference. People who can afford to change their energy mix, who can afford to, for example, put solar panels on their own home, that's an avenue option, as David rightly points out, for a certain socio-economic group. But I do think it is very, very important where there is not the option for communities to be able to afford that, for governments to step in and be that in a region where their major industries are reliant on emissions, highly emitting coal mines or other industries. There's a need for government to step in and support that transition. Be communities who are very much at the lower socio-economic end of the spectrum. As David rightly says, in a heat wave, they're the people that get ill or die. I mean, governments need to be the ones to plant the trees in the areas to reduce that impact. And then we just need national governments with targets. I'm a Labor councillor. It's best for me to stay out of the political debate, but, we just need national emissions targets that gives industry and other levels of government certainty to act.
Sally or David, any final comments?
I think there's things definitely that, there's more and more coming online all the time. Like I said, in terms of innovation that is going to hit people's households, I really do think that it won't be long before in Bunnings we'll have products that mean you can capture or filter rainwater or water from the air, or you can recycle water in your home. Like the solar panel revolution that we've seen in Australia, I think there'll be more and more local utilities. A really exciting example I've been looking at lately is Glam Corner, who are an Australian startup you might have heard of. They do rental dresses. They're known for doing bridesmaids dresses and formal occasion dresses, but their biggest growth area is actually casual wear and business wear, and they're moving into clothing as a subscription service. And their fulfillment centre in Alexandria is currently processing 50,000 tonnes of textile a month, and they are coming up with innovation to wash and clean that fabric very much more efficiently than we do in our homes. So thinking like that, kind of thing like precinct scale, city scale innovation that will mean we're using clothing completely differently. We have 5 outfits turn up for us at the start of the week, and they're, it sounds very, very, it sounds extravagant, but actually it may be extremely efficient for densely populated areas. So I think keep a lookout for all the ways that you might be able to purchase a bit differently, and look at service-based businesses rather than buying your own, because there's lots of really interesting options coming out.
Yes, indeed, because circular economy is really about flipping the service model around. Yes. David?
I think just to answer your question about what can happen at the local level, look, again, at the very start, we had students talking about the impacts and the work that they're doing. And I think the range of protests and the voice of youth in the past couple of years has been extraordinary, not only as a social movement, but as a way to really change the language and the discourse around climate change. Who is being affected, and what the implications are. And I just think that's been a really amazing development in the last couple of years. And so I would just thank the students for that and encourage them to keep it up.
Excellent. That's fine. I think now we are over to you, Brooke, please, to coordinate Q&A with the audience.
Sure. Okay. So there was one from Caitlin Hazel. She says, great presentation. Do you think you need qualifications in economics, finance, accounting to work in circular economy roles?
Maybe that's for Sally, I think.
Yeah, I answered that in the chat, but I don't, it's so multidisciplinary, honestly, and it's touching every part of the economy as we've discussed. So I don't think there's any qualification that's a prerequisite to work in circular economy. Myself, I've got a communications and arts background. There's definitely creative work and design work happening in the circular economy. You've got engineering, logistics. Honestly, almost any qualification has an amazing role to play, a really important role to play in the circular economy, because it's going to be part of everything we do.
Great. Jean Guliesper, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. I have had this research 3 years ago, and it's about healthcare waste, and it was funded by our regional DOH. The output needs to be an ordinance that will regulate the management of healthcare waste. The problem is it is not the priority of our local government unit. Any thoughts on this? Suggestions, recommendations, how I can implement the output of my study?
It's probably for me. I mean, look, again, I mean, elections coming up, you know, people feel differently and have a chance in New South Wales, if you're a resident of New South Wales, to express a view on the 4th of September about these kinds of issues. But more generally, I think, you know, Ali and David are great exemplars of this in their academic research, reaching out to councils that are interested in funding this research, engaging with the councils that are interested in this work. Often it's an example of a way to show a success, and then often local governments pick up those ideas and run with them after the success has been shown. I sort of like to think of local governments as, you know, lots of little randomised control trials where one council does it and then they compare to all the other councils that haven't done it, and then councils kind of look at that success and lean up and look over the fence and go, oh, that's a great idea, I'll nab that idea and do something with it. So, you know, don't give up if it's just the local government at the end of your street. Look more broadly, because there's a lot of others that will be interested and engaged.
Great. So Maud Dumont, regarding nuclear energy, an economy shifting to zero carbon model will require an enormous transfer of energy from fossil fuel to green electricity and potentially hydrogen through green electricity. Nuclear energy has been acknowledged by the IPCC as the cleanest energy source for both carbon and physical footprints. Carbon footprint is 4 times lower than renewable, requires much less mining and renewable, and 1,000 times less space. It is also the only energy where negative externalities, nuclear waste, are being managed. Australia has also one of the biggest reserve of uranium, but nuclear energy is facing acceptance headwinds here in Australia and around the rich world, Germany and France, etc. What is the view of the panel on fission energy to help transition Australia's and the world's economy to clean economy? That's a good question.
So I'll take that one.
Thank you.
And I'll say this is one of those sort of silver bullet ideas that people often throw up, that here's the one thing that can solve anything. And not only is it problematic for that reason, but nuclear has a whole number of other problems, and a number of the assumptions in that comment are just off. What I often tell people after living in Arizona for 15 years is, unless you can show me how you can mine for uranium and dispose of nuclear waste without doing harm to indigenous communities, I don't want to hear it. The damage is constant, the damage is long-standing. Where I come from, where I was last in Arizona, the cancer rates on the Navajo reservation for youth were 17 times the national average. I had students in my classes every term who had illnesses or parents or grandparents dying from the leftover effects of uranium mining on the reservation. So I don't want to hear anything about nuclear until someone solves that problem of the disproportionate impact, the injustice of the nuclear cycle from mining to waste. The other thing about nuclear that is the problem is that the costs, I mean, nuclear is one of those things where the costs are put on the ratepayer, right? You can't do this unless you have a massive, massive investment. And then, of course, companies will walk away from the risk. So it's often left to individual ratepayers. This is certainly the case all across the U.S. With communities that are dealing with decommissioning plants. So, and then the last thing, of course, on the economic side is it just doesn't make sense economically anymore. It doesn't make sense as a technology, even if it did 50 years ago. It certainly doesn't anymore. We have a variety of new technologies that are renewable, that don't do harm to environments or to indigenous peoples, that don't have to include those kinds of unjust impacts. That said, the last point I'll make, though, not on nuclear, but on renewables, and this gets to the circular economy question as well, we do need to pay attention to the impacts on communities of mining for even renewable energy, right? Because mining is mining, right? And mining companies, do the same for uranium as they do for lithium. And so we need attention to especially the impacts, as we've seen here in Australia, the impacts on indigenous communities, on Aboriginal communities and heritage for all kinds of mining, even if that mining is being used to derive elements and materials for the renewables economy.
Professor Schlossberg, there's Miguel Loyola has said also that you have spoken about community engagement on planning, but many times community is against sustainable policies. Can you please address this issue and what to do when the community is against sustainable policies?
I think Linda brought this up before, and I thought the answer was great. And look, here's my one example. Even when we did the work for the City of Sydney, we had denialists who were residents of the city. So we weren't really talking to people about climate change, though. We were talking to people about what they thought was necessary for a good adaptation policy. And so this one denialist, it was great because you mentioned this earlier, Linda, he lived in Heritage Terrace where he couldn't put up just a shade over the window, right, to keep the sun from coming in and heating up the room on the north side of the house. Just a simple thing. And as soon as everybody in the room agreed with him that that was ridiculous and he should be able to do that, he got on board with everything, right? So just having that support for the one thing that even a denialist thought was necessary, it created a more open, a more inclusive, a more deliberative space where everybody was sharing solutions and others were agreeing, with others on what it was that they needed. So I think that kind of community engagement is really crucial. Engaging people, as Linda said, with their own needs, with their own histories, with their own knowledge of local areas is absolutely crucial.
There's a great book, if people haven't read it, by Dr. Rebecca Huntley. It's her most recent book, and it's just talking about how to talk about climate change. She's a social researcher. So if you're looking to kind of have more conversations with people and understand how to communicate better about climate change, it's a fantastic book to read. And the other point I just want to make to David's point about understanding about, that renewables are also processes that we need to think through is the waste from renewables is also not insignificant. And so we're also seeing, for example, a lot of solar farms in New South Wales, but at the end of their life, the materials of those, including, heavy trace minerals, are just being left and dumped. And this is a big issue for local governments too, that I'm hearing increasingly a lot of concern about. And so, again, we're talking to the planning approval bodies for solar farms in New South Wales and trying to make sure that there's conditions in there to ensure that at the end of life of a solar farm, just as you would at the end of life of a mine, that there's conditions to remediate the land, that there's conditions to make sure, for example, that those materials are recycled. I've just had a mayor in Parkes, this is such an Australian example, build a solar farm on their properties out in Parkes with conditions to raise them up, because it sort of doesn't really matter how high the solar panels are, so that there's enough space underneath for the sheep to graze. So they're literally running sheep at the same time as they're running a solar farm. Just a beautiful kind of Australian regional example of multiple land use in action, but also action on climate change.
Pretty amazing. Maud Dumont has thanked the panelists for their amazing insights. MD Abdullah Al-Mamoun has asked, how can we blend the forefathers' tradition, for example, a biodegradable craftsmanship and science in circular economies to regenerate the ecosystem, avoid plastic waste and reuse communities' natural resources-based products? Do you want to do that one, Ali?
There's a couple of questions. I was just looking at I think I missed the gist of the question. Maybe if we can summarize the question again. Is it about?
I think he's to regenerate the ecosystem, avoid plastic waste, and reuse communities' natural resources-based products instead.
Got it. Thanks, Brooke. I think this is a point that was made earlier. I think Sally made it. It's about materials in use in society, and the example of mining and gold being sent to landfill and so on. But plastic is a classic example in the economy of a material that flows in, and we haven't really solved that plastic challenge yet. It's a one-way stream at the moment towards the landfill. Plastics are different materials. Polypropylene, for example, is only recycled at the rate of 1% at the moment, but it's heavily used in all sorts of products, in medical products. So it ends up quite a useful material for medical purposes, but it's very difficult to degrade, very hard to recycle. So the local solutions in this regard, village type of solutions. But if we think about the circular economy, circulations of materials, there's two main types of circulations. One is a technical circulation, which is the inorganic type of circulation of materials. But the other one, which I think is the answer to this question, the biological cycle, the lower temperature cycle, those types of processes that are used to produce those materials could be quite the solution. So we can think about ways. As an example, one of the research projects we are working on is using indigenous fungi to degrade polypropylene and trying to find ways to make that more efficient. So in this way, we don't need to send the plastic to high temperature incineration processes, for example, and we can generate nice, valuable products out of that. Another example on plastics, I guess, is again, back to the medical waste. When we look at materials being used in absorbent pads in the clinic, in hospitals. These are composite materials. They're very difficult to disassemble. It's medical waste, it's contaminated. And so it's kind of the only direction for that is a microwave type of treatment and then decontaminating it by high temperature decomposition, incineration. However, we're working with some nurses very interested in sustainability in the medical sector. And they're looking at ways we could replace these medical pads using biomaterials that are degradable. And so one way we'd look at that is how we study the entire cycle, the life cycle of that existing material. And it's so funny that it's, it's very, very bad in a way that these materials go around the world to reach the clinic. So again, the word local is very important. We need to generate local solutions at our doorstep, in the household. I think Sally mentioned the waste being dealt with at the household better than moving the waste around. So.
Jacqueline Wong has said that there's so many good ideas being shared here. So many innovations and research is being generated in universities worldwide. What recommendations would you have for university leaders globally who want to do something about climate change, learn about adaptation and pluralist strategies is motivating, and it seems like students have a lot of openings to take leadership. Where are the areas of greatest need?
So maybe David.
It's a great question, and look, I think university sustainability strategies have come a long way in the last 20 years. One of the things about what the University of Sydney did last year in the development of its new strategy was to reach out to students and to include them in the process and really get at what it was that students wanted, not just what they wanted sort of theoretically, and we want lower emissions and we want better investments and all that, but what they wanted in their everyday life in the university. What they wanted to see on in the shop. It's one of the reasons why one of the goals of the university is to be plastics free in the next 5 years. Right? Students just they want to be able to live their values when they're walking across campus, when they're buying food, when they're spending their time here. And so, moving from plastics to degradable materials in the wrapping or in takeaway food containers, bringing on industrial composters onto campus so that all that material can be taken care of right here on campus instead of going to a sorting center or a landfill. I mean, all of this was really influenced by the interest of students. And so I think the recommendation, as always, is, keep the pressure up. It certainly has worked here at the University of Sydney on a range of issues, just showing that student interest. And I think it's not just about protesting, it's about making some links. So I think one of the things that really mattered here, for example, was students at the University of Sydney were surveyed on their sense of belonging, and people felt really alienated. We had the lowest scores of any of the G8 universities. And so the university saw the sustainability strategy as a way not just to deal with sustainability issues, but to deal with students' sense of belonging onto the campus by actually listening to and appealing to the values that they're bringing onto campus. So I think making yourself clear and making the reasons clear to university leaders, it works. It should work.
And I think, yeah, go ahead, Linda, you first, please.
I was just going to say that I think the other thing is recognising that this is such a multidisciplinary task, and that every different academic specialty probably has a really strong ability to make a contribution. I mean, my father had a PhD in chemistry and he went on to become an environmental scientist, and he was, it shows you how old I am, but he was kind of one of the first people to really call himself an environmental scientist. And he very much had the view that, scientists were the ones that could do the research on climate change. He was, I think, quite devastated when I went on to study psychology. It's very useful in politics, I can tell you, but I'm really interested in the behavioural component. But I mean, I think the point is, and you've heard this from all the speakers, I think all of us come from very, very different disciplines and backgrounds. There's a contribution in your research and your teaching that you can also make here. And don't rule out the contribution, no matter the discipline that you come from, because it's such a multidisciplinary problem. We've probably all got something to add. So, find your niche, add it in.
Thanks, Linda. I was just going to say, look, university leaders can also bring the research out. I think there's opportunities for entrepreneurial leaders to come out with these, nice and excellent solutions for waste, for emissions, and so on. And we heard Sally say earlier, this is expected to be a $2 trillion business by 2040. So it's no small business opportunity. The environment is a business opportunity, I think, as well. So.
Okay, I think we've got a couple more questions, but I'm very aware of the time. So what do you think, Ali? Keep going with the questions, or? Look,
I think we can register them. We will try, certainly we could end here if you like, Brooke, and we can try certainly to come back to those people. We apologize to them, of course, that we have run out of time. We've gone over time because the topic is, I think, very close to the heart of all the panelists and all the audience. So I appreciate that very much. I wanted to summarize just very briefly and then end the webinar today. And I think it's been a discussion that's brought forward, as Linda just said, different perspectives on policy, on local council, on circular economy, on technology a little bit as well. And it's certainly an opportunity that is waiting for the new generations, as well as us, I should say, the existing generations, the current generations, to act now. What is important for me, I think, was that the idea of design and designing out waste, because almost everything we produce at the moment is disposed. So take that as a message. Design is so important in the circular economy transition. And local solutions, I think the other key message I heard from is from Linda, where we heard her say that it's very important to understand local, understand how local activities and local, partnerships with the community are so important towards building this transition, the solutions that we need to for climate, solving climate 2030. And the example of Newcastle, I think, as one, it's happening now. I think we heard that there's a lot of interest in it in the community. There's certainly a shift that's happening. It's a political shift also mentioned that is also starting to happen as we continue to see these climate challenges and changes in the community. I think importantly also we heard about the wedge effect and that from David that it's not a silver bullet solution that we are looking for anywhere. It's got to be multiple solutions, multiple pathways, portfolio solutions of different ways of doing things, and small dents add up and can lead to the overall reduction in emissions, significant reductions in the emissions. But also importantly about climate justice and the need to be inclusive and have inclusive processes for decision making and adaptation. And also the need for funding in this area of adaptation to really deal with the justice issue and the equity issue that we also experience nowadays, even in Australia, in developed world, I beg your pardon. So with that, I think I want to finish off to thank the panelists, one and all, for their contributions today, for their insights, their reflections. And I'm hoping and looking forward to crossing again with the panelists in different conversations on the climate challenge question, and hope we could share also solutions in the near future. Thank you all, and thanks to our audience, thanks to Brooke, thanks to APRU and everybody, and we will finish the proceedings here. Goodbye for now.
Thanks, Ali.
Thank you.